Hi everyone, my name is Justin Dearborn and this is my 1952 Dodge M37. I just wanted to make a video to explain how I built this truck and why I built it that way, because I have a lot of questions about the way I did it and how to get it to that point. What I wanted, as you all know, a stock M37 has about 78 horsepower and goes 45 miles an hour tops. This truck with stock axles and a flathead engine will do 70 to 75. Not all day long, but it'll do 65 all day long, happily. So that's what I was shooting for. I wanted to get a vehicle that I could use every day on a modern road, something I could take camping, something I could steer easy, that'll also have excellent off-road capabilities and on-road capabilities. So I'll go over everything that I did to this particular truck to get it to that point, and if you guys have any questions, I can answer it down below or however you want to do it, but there's a lot of research that I put into this truck that I get questioned all the time on. So let's get to it. So the first thing I want to talk about is the overall stance of the truck, and it doesn't take much to make these trucks look significantly better. All I did was bring the front end up 2 inches. How I did that was with leaf springs. I managed to find a leaf pack from the front that had 2 extra springs in it, whether it was put on a truck with a plow or what, I don't know. But it has 2 extra leaf springs in the pack with more arch, and I also added 2 short bottom springs in addition to that to get it another inch or so. So total I got about 2 inches of lift, and it's all leaf spring, there's no blocks, there's nothing weird in there. So that's what I did with the lift to get it sitting level, so it looks good in my opinion. The second thing, which is the big question I always get, is these wheels and tires. These wheels are from Marsh Racing Wheel. Unfortunately, the fellow who was building these things, 2 weeks after I got these in the mail, he passed away of a heart attack. So this rim is not available anymore, unfortunately. But this rim is a 9 3/4 inch wide, 7.5 offset, and it has the 5-lug Bud M37 pattern. It is balanced. It's a 16.5 size, and the reason I went with 16.5 is because I could get these surplus tires cheap, and they're the right size for the truck, in my opinion. They're a good size, good width, and everything. So that's what I got going on there. These are just standard super winch locking hubs that you've all seen. So there's nothing super special there, but the rims and tires are the big thing. I can go down the road, they're balanced, they don't wobble or shake, or I don't have to worry about the split ring blowing apart. They're good to go. So that's what I got going on for the stance and the wheels and tires of this vehicle. So the engine I selected for this particular truck was a 251 flathead. The reason I went with a 251 versus a 230 or even the bigger 265 is I knew I wasn't going to be able to get the power that I wanted out of a 230. There's more aftermarket parts for the 230, but you're just not going to get the horsepower and torque out of it, in my opinion. There's a lot of people who are going to argue that, but for what I wanted a big block 251 Chrysler Flathead. So I chose a 251, I balanced it, rebuilt the thing. I had Delta Camshaft grind me an M400 grind cam. That's the number of cam grind that they use. They call it the M400. It's 400 thousandths lift. Not sure of the duration. Stock cam lift is 375 thousandths. So I bumped up the cam lift a little bit. Another thing I did to this engine was shave the cylinder head 60 thousandths to bump the compression ratio. Next thing I did was I ported the manifolds and ported the block. So there's good flow through there. And one thing I wanted to show you on this engine is that about 10 or 15% of these engines that I understand had full flow capability. And when I say full flow, I mean the oil filtration system. Most of these were bypass filtration, which just took a little bit of oil out of the main oiling system at a time and ran it through a filter and then shot it back in. Well, this system is every ounce of oil that gets sucked through that oil pump gets pumped through this filter and back into the oil galley, so it's 100% oil filtration. To convert that, it took me a very long time to find this on the internet, but under the crossover tube, if you pull the oil pan, flip the engine upside down, you pull that crossover tube off. If you look down in the block, on the opposite side of the block is the oil pump. If you look down in that galley about 3 or 4 inches down, there's a threaded section of the hole. You have to go in there where I think it's an 1/8 inch or think it's an 1/8 inch plug, and plug it, and what that does is blocks it so the oil will go out one fitting and back in the other fitting. So that's how you set it up for full flow if you have that block. It took me a long time to figure that out, so that will help somebody in the future to convert theirs to full flow if it has provisions for it. The other thing I did with this thing, it has hardened valve seats in it, which it had stock because this particular engine was an industrial 251. So that's done. The oil filtration's done. The blocks, we talked about that. The carburetor. Carburetor selection took me a long time to come up with because there's multiple carburetors you can do, single carburetors. There's stock carburetors. So the stock M37 governed carburetor is a very low flowing carburetor. I'll get into that after with some information I have on the bench. But this is the carburetor I ended up choosing. It's a Weber 3236 and it's a progressive linkage, and it is very good for this particular engine in my opinion. It woke it up quite a bit. Another thing that I did was installed a dual outlet manifold, exhaust manifold. George Ash from Pennsylvania built this for me. It's a stock 4-bolt exit manifold, which I consider to be the high flow manifold of these things. And what he did was he welded another outlet on it. So now this thing is flanged for two 2.5 inch outlets on the manifold while keeping it bolted to the intake. I was going to do a header, but I decided I wanted to be able to keep intake heat because intake heat is a very big factor in these engines. If you lose your intake heat, you're not going to have proper atomization inside your intake manifold during low RPM or what have you. So that's why I decided I may be sacrificing a little bit of flow over the header, but I wanted to keep my intake manifold heat, and I did, and it works excellent. That's about it for the engine modifications. I guess we can get into the power steering next. So the power steering setup that I decided to use was from Snake River. You can all get all that information on their website. It's pretty basic. It's a Ford power steering pump with a bracket to mount it to my particular engine. They supplied it with a power steering box, the power steering pump, the hoses, the hanger on the firewall for the shaft, and everything it takes to convert the steering shaft into the new steering box. Luckily, the stock pitman arm fit right on the box, so that was excellent. There was no issues there. And this is the power steering box. It was said to come off a 1976 Dodge 3/4 ton, I believe it is. And that was pretty slick. There's a conversion bracket right here. You just bolt it to your frame. You have to drill a little bit. And then they sent you these universals to cut your stock shaft and, you know, get it to where it needs to be. This is pretty basic. I'm not going to go into depth with this because you've all seen it online before. This is just basically the kit that they sell. So as far as the axles go, I wanted an axle that was going to be capable of going down the highway and not exploding. So what I did was I went through Robert Stahl at Veteran Vehicle. He's a good friend of mine, lives a couple hours down the road here. He did 489 ring and pinions for me. From the stock 583, that made a massive difference on my road speed. It geared it up, I think, 12%, and the tires gave it another little bit of extra gear up in that department. So I've hit 72, 73 miles an hour in this truck. I wouldn't do it all the time, but I can go 60, 65 without any problems all day long with this engine combination, these tires and wheels, and the axle ratio that I have. Another thing I have in my rear end is I have a lock-right locker installed in it. It's an automatic locking and unlocking locker, so it's not as ideal as an ARB air locker, but when I did it, it worked good. And it works excellent off-road, and it's very well-mannered on-road. The truck's so heavy and the sidewall's so big on the tire, it doesn't click and pop and hop very bad in this particular vehicle, and it was set up correctly and very well. So I'm very happy with the axle setup, and it's been working really well. Okay, so getting into the carburetor situation and how I chose it took a very significant amount of research. So I'll just do the quick and dirty on it. So this is a stock, what do they call it? ETW1 carburetor. It has a built-in governor which is obnoxious if anyone's ever tried to drive these on the road. But necessary when you have a 230, because if you run a 230 much over 2,500 RPM, stock form, in my opinion, is going to turn into a hand grenade. So this carburetor, which ran excellent on my 251 after I built it, and it got 12 miles a gallon everywhere I went, it was restricting me a lot because of the airflow. And the restriction is in the venturi. The smallest part of this carburetor, actually the smallest part of the whole intake system, including the manifold hole, is the venturi inside this carburetor. The venturi in this stock M37 carburetor is 1.25 inches. 1.25 venturi, if you convert that to area, inches of area, with this simple formula of 3.14 times diameter, 1.25 times diameter, 1.25 divided by 4, gives you area in cubic inches. So with that being said, this 1.25 venturi carburetor has 1.21 inches of area for airflow to go through. This is a ball and ball E7T2. I don't know what engine this came off of. I'm assuming it came off of maybe a later 60s Power Wagon with a 251 or possibly an industrial engine. This E7T2 carburetor, you would find stock on Flatheads, does not have a governor on it. So right there, I would imagine, would give you a little bit more flow. But the big thing with this carburetor is it has an 1.11 venturi, so it's bigger than this small 1.25. So the amount of area of venturi of this carburetor is 1.41 inches. So you're going from 1.21 with the stock M37 carburetor to 1.41 just by going to this other variation of carburetor for the Flathead engine. What I chose to do is the Weber 3236. With the Weber 3236, you have a 26mm primary barrel and a 27mm secondary barrel. When I say barrel, I mean venturi. So if you add those two numbers up, the venturi size airflow area is 1.71. So going from my stock ETW1 carburetor, 1.21 inches of area, I moved up to 1.71 inches of area, and the fuel mileage of that is outstanding. I'm still getting 11 to 12 miles a gallon, and it did wake the engine up. My engine, with the camshaft and it being balanced, capable of spinning more RPMs, it was desperate for more air. There's other options too for carburetors. You can buy two carburetor setup. If you bought a two carburetor setup, it depends who sells it. You could do two of these carburetors, which would, you could just simply do the numbers on that, it'd be 2.8. Whatever. So the other thing you're asking, well, the carburetor, that's great, but I'm sure the intake manifold is just as restrictive. I can't speak for the design of the intake manifold, but I do know that the intake hole that your carburetor bolts to is 1.75. So that gives you 2.404 inches of area. So that is not a restriction. Other thing people are going to ask about, my Weber 3236 is going to a 2-barrel down, it's choking it down into a 1-barrel. Well, that adapter gets narrowed down to 1 5/8. That's the smallest part of that adapter. That 1 5/8 hole is still 2.36 inches of area. So that is still greater than my carburetor. So as you can see in this intake system, typically the restriction is in the carburetor, not the intake manifold, which I originally thought was the case for years. So with the research, this is what I found with the different venturi sizes of different carburetor setups that you can do. Okay, so I want to talk about the differential and the axles. One thing I forgot to mention when I was going over the axle part of my truck is my truck has high-strength axle shafts in it. There's a couple different manufacturers. We made them over the years. Foot Engineering makes them. They're out of California. Any axle is going to break if you harangue it too hard, but these things got a bad rap. M37s in general got a bad rap, and I kind of want to explain why I think they got a bad rap. So first off, is the axle shafts that the M37s use in stock form were terrible. Old metallurgy, terrible hardening protocols or whatever they did back then. They were very weak. People talk about, pulling through a pile of leaves and snapping an axle shaft. So the first thing you can do to upgrade the strength and capability of axle shafts and M37s is upgrade the shafts themselves, buy new shafts. And the other thing is their offset differential, so that short shaft and the long shaft, and that plays havoc on them too as well. But if you get yourself a set of high strength axle shafts, it's going to mitigate that substantially. Second thing I want to talk about with axles is these things in stock, when they rolled out of the factory from Chrysler back when they were built back in the 50s, or I guess this one would be 52, but they didn't set these things up very well. If you look at these, the lash isn't set well. There's a lot of play in the things. And another thing is these things used fibrous thrust washers. So the thrust washers are deep in this case. They're behind the side gears, side spider gears. And they built it out of this fibrous material that almost guaranteed to fall apart after a few years. So what happens is they fall apart, they break up inside the differential, and they plug the oil flow to the pinion bearing, and they just get all crunched up in here, and it's not a good setup. So when my axles were rebuilt by Bob Stahl, he had custom machined brass washers. So you get rid of those fibrous ones and you put brass ones in, and this thing was meticulously set up with preload, lash, all of that stuff. From the factory, they were not set up well. They were either heeled on the gear, toed on the gear, too much slop. They were just awful from the factory. Another thing is these ring gear bolts that they used back in the 50s, Bob told me were somewhere between a grade 3 and a grade 5 bolt. So they were very weak. So what Bob does is have custom machined grade 8 fasteners that have the head milled down to fit in these. So all of my axles have grade 8 fasteners to hold the ring gear on, with brand new ring and pinions built most recently by a couple of other companies that have come out. So if you add all of these things together, the loose differential, the poor setup, the bad washers, the weak ring gear bolts, all of those things equal out to be a reasonably weak axle. If you address these things, get them all set up, get them properly replaced, properly lubricated, and you go the extra mile and get the grade 8 fasteners. And the other thing is driving them correctly, not dumping the clutch and trying to do burnouts on a 6,000-pound military truck. It makes for a reasonably strong axle. This chuck itself is very strong. It's about 100 pounds. It's a 9 5/8 ring gear, so it's got some meat to it. You just need to get them set up right, keep them properly maintained, and get some good axle shafts in it, and you have a reasonably good axle. It's not going to be as good as a corporate 14-bolt full floater. It might be close to getting on par with a Dana 60 strength-wise, not quite because of the configuration of the axle shafts, but you can get these pretty good, better than they get credit for anyway. So that's what I have on these. The other thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is the winch. It's a Braden LU4. This is the winch that comes stock on these trucks. This truck did not have a winch on it when I bought it. I got this one years later and put it on, so I had to get a PTO and the shafts and everything to make it work, and the frame extensions and everything else. So it works really good. I don't use it all the time, but when I do need it, I really need it. So I'm glad I have it. The other thing I wanted to mention was the fan in the front. It's a 16-inch 3000 CFM electrical pusher fan, or I use it as a pusher. The reason that's there is because the 251 is 2 inches longer than the stock 230, and I didn't want to have to deal with moving my radiator, which could be done. It's not a big deal, but I decided to go with this because it's a RestoMod anyway. I suggest to anyone who's building their truck, build it the way they want it, not how somebody else wants to see it, because that's just ridiculous. Build things the way you want it and don't care what anyone else says. So that's what I ended up doing. It doesn't look factory, but the rest of the truck doesn't either, so it's perfect. The other thing I had to do to put that 251 is right up 2 inches in front of the stock motor mount holes in the frame, or the brackets on the frame. There's like a pad with an escutcheon on it that I drilled 2 half-inch holes in, and then just used a stock motor mount and bolted it 2 inches ahead. That was the only adjustments I had to make on the front of the engine to make it fit versus the 230. The other thing I got here is my little buddy here called Little Angry. A friend of mine in Salt Lake City, Jerry Whitlock, built that for me. You may have seen his videos before. If you're watching this video, you've probably seen his video. He's a great guy and he has an outstanding truck. He's a big fan of RestoMods as well. So he built this, and he does a good job with that. And I would suggest, if you like this video, check his videos out. He's got a great truck. I drove it. It's unbelievable. So I think that's all I had on the front of the truck for you guys. So this is my interior. I did it a long time ago. Something I forgot to mention, I think earlier in the video, is I've owned this truck since 1997. I bought this truck when I was 12 years old. So I started building it with my father at 12, 13 years old, and I've had it all this time. And when you have a vehicle that long, you gotta almost rebuild things again. So it's kind of fun to rebuild things after seeing what you did years and years ago. So years and years ago, the interior that I chose was this interior. It's very simple. I got rid of the battery under the passenger seat, and what I ended up doing was, this whole truck's converted to 12 volt. I put the battery in the center, and I just put this hinged, basically it's just a piece of plywood, Advantech plywood. It's just a 12 volt battery. I think that's actually a glass mat battery. This is on hinges. I fold that down. I got 2 soup cans for cup holders, and these, I just made some simple brackets to put these seats in. These seats are out of a Chevy S10, I think, maybe late 90s, early 2000s Chevy S10. I really don't care about the way they look. I think they look good. They're black. They're pretty neutral looking. They're very comfortable. Anyone who sat in the stock canvas split seats knows how uncomfortable they are, and that's not what I was shooting for in this truck. Like I said, again, this truck is not purist built. It never will be. I know a lot of people want everything back to original, but that's not the way I wanted my truck. I wanted it to be the way I wanted it, and comfortable to boot. And if you notice the blue rope holding the top on, strictly, this is for the purists to irritate them. So if you're asking why it has a blue rope, it's for irritation reasons. Other than that, that's the interior.